Hi, folks, and welcome again to Israel Explained. Right now, we're definitely in what is the darkest moment for Israel since the opening of the ground campaign. Um, it looked like Hamas was reeling, and I believe that it still is, from the strength of the renewed Israeli offensive after the last hostage deal. But two incidents have um, dulled the Israeli morale and taken away a lot of the belief of people in the country from the operation. Those two incidents are, of course, the 9 soldiers killed in Sujawiya and the 3 hostages mistakenly identified as terrorists by soldiers in the same neighborhood who were shot and killed. Both incidents have really drained the sense of determination that Israel had. So it's really a question of how it deals with this crisis. And one of the main reasons that this has had so much effect in Israel is because the government and the military had only really begun to, or were at least in the middle of the process of restoring faith in those institutions. And those two failures immediately remind people of the failures that led to October 7th, leading to a real kind of crisis of confidence. So a lot of people are feeling right now that the Israeli offensive in Gaza is not achieving its strategic objectives, or at least not achieving them quickly enough, and that there is tension between different goals that Israel's trying to achieve, to destroy Hamas, to get back the hostages, and to continue to enjoy American support by letting in humanitarian aid and all of those sorts of things. Yesterday, the cabinet was supposed to meet to discuss a future hostage deal. In the end, they didn't discuss that because conditions hadn't matured yet enough to lay a real proposal at the doorstep of the cabinet members. So instead, they talked about bringing aid into Gaza, and particularly the opening of the Kerem Shalom terminal, which allows aid to be brought directly from Israel into Gaza. It's not far from Rafah, but it comes from Israel itself. Members of the cabinet were not happy with that development, or at least not all of them were. Some members of cabinet who did not speak out in the meeting, by the way, leaked to the Israeli press or told the Israeli press anonymously, quote, "We lost the only leverage we had on Sinwar. He has food, gas, and gasoline. What's in his interest is not necessarily to negotiate over the hostages. He has what he needs." Meanwhile, Ben-Gvir, as always, put it more confrontationally. He said that Hamas is able to kill more soldiers now because it has more supplies. Um, so there is criticism in the government that Israeli strategy involved in bringing in aid is actually making a hostage deal less likely. But I am not sure that that is the main dynamic at play here. I think it's really something else. As I said in our last episode, when this tragedy happened and 3 hostages had been killed, this is likely to bring an escalation of the efforts of the hostage families to get their loved ones released. And we've certainly seen that, just as predicted. The tensions between the government and the hostages' families have always been significant, and we've seen that in every meeting. But whatever was keeping those together was keeping the families from escalating completely. The sense that that could harm the war effort, that veneer has gone to some extent. The death of those 3 hostages really broke something fundamental in that relationship. So some of the hostage families, the leaders of the hostage families, or at least the most visible ones, have formed an encampment in front of the Kirya. The Kirya is the main defense ministry compound in Tel Aviv, across from the Azrieli buildings. And so they're setting up a tent city there. They said that they're not going to leave, and they're considering going on a hunger strike. Mirav Leshem Gonen, whose daughter Romi is among the hostages in Gaza, said, quote, "We're sleeping here tonight and every night going forward until we are no longer ignored." Um, we also saw something else. For the first time, we saw significant counter demonstrations to the families because there were two things going on previously, right? One was the families felt they shouldn't cross certain lines in order not to hamper the military effort. Meanwhile, those who thought that the families of the hostages were going too far in their demands to curtail the military operation weren't saying much publicly and certainly weren't demonstrating because there's a lot of sympathy for the hostages in Israel. But the escalation of the response of the hostage families, plus the tragic events that have occurred in Gaza, have eroded both of those things. So now we have counter demonstrations and we have escalated demonstrations in favor of the hostages. So the schism in Israeli society, which has never really been cured, is once again out in the open after a at least veneer of unity in the operation until now. And unfortunately, the pro-deal camp, the pro-hostage family camp, so to speak, is associated with the opposition to Netanyahu. So activists from that uh, judicial reform demonstrations, the people who used to close down Kaplan, some of them are involved in these demonstrations as well. And the people who are forming the counter demonstrations are unfortunately associated with Netanyahu and his supporters. So we're seeing some of that rhetoric and those tensions that were dominating Israeli politics before the operation coming out now, especially when the hostages movement were giving speeches and people mentioned Netanyahu, there were cries of shame, the same cries we saw before October 7th in the judicial reforms demonstrations. Now, a lot of people there in the demonstration said, "Stop it, don't involve politics." But the truth is, on some level, that ship has sailed. If you're part of one demonstration, you're seen as helping one side, and if you're part of another demonstration, you're seen as helping the other, whether you like it or not. And that brings poisonous domestic partisanship into the attempt to run the operation that is very, very bad for the unity of the country and for the viability of the operation to destroy Hamas. There is absolutely no question that Yahya Sinwar and other Hamas leaders are completely aware of this schism and are intentionally manipulating it. And up until the death of the um, three hostages by mistake, their ability to do so, their success in doing so, was limited, although certainly noticeable. But now it has come out into the open and has become a serious problem. And I'm sure Sinwar and Hamas are absolutely delighted by this. I think that one of the ways that Hamas is manipulating this, and I think it's very hard to avoid this conclusion at this point, is that they're executing hostages in stages. Executing hostages, um, releasing enough information or leaving bodies for the IDF to find so that every day Israel discovers that another hostage is killed. That ups the level of panic in their families and supporters, understandably, and puts an immense amount of pressure on the government. And Sinwar, as part of this, is also demanding that, as part of any future hostage negotiation, the war end. He's saying, "I'm not going to go into another major hostage negotiation unless the war ends," because he feels that the only way he can win is if he manages to keep what he has so far. That requires complete cessation of hostilities. Sinwar made a bad calculation earlier that a hostage deal would seriously dull the Israeli attack. But since that didn't happen, now he's trying something else. In my opinion, unfortunately, killing hostages, putting pressure on Israel, and then trying to force Israel into ceasing the entire operation in return for the hostages that are remaining. Now, there are some reports that contradict that Hamas is firmly demanding the end of the war. Mostly they come from Egyptian sources. So Reuters put out a story a couple of hours ago And they said that according to Egyptian sources, both Hamas and Israel are willing to reach a deal, but they have differences over certain issues. So those issues were the following. Hamas is demanding that Israel withdraw from certain areas in Gaza, probably strategically important ones, and Israel is refusing to do so. Another point of contention, according to this report in Reuters, is that Hamas wants to give Israel a predetermined list of people that they want to release without taking into account at all what Israel wants. And Israel has had this position, which seems to be eroding right now, of the women and children who hadn't been released in the previous deal need to come out first before anything else happens. It looks like, according to the Egyptian report, that Israel is starting to waver on that and is willing to allow Hamas to release whoever it wants. But what Hamas also wants is for Israel not to know how many hostages they're releasing and who they're releasing in advance. And that would kind of stop Israel from being able to plan when it's going to restart the operation. Now, this seems to contradict the reports that I've been hearing from better sources, by the way, that Hamas, or at least Sinwar, is demanding a complete cessation of the conflict. And there could be a couple of explanations for that. One is the Egyptians are simply wrong or are being too optimistic. And I don't trust Egyptian sources for a couple of reasons. One, they're always trying to play up their influence in the negotiations at the expense of Qatar, despite the fact that, as we all know, Qatar is playing a much more important role. So I do trust what Qatar says more. They're speaking more from a dominant position in the negotiations, and it's the Qataris who are saying that Sinwar is demanding a full cessation. And then there's another possibility. It may not be that the Egyptian sources are less trustworthy, although I think they probably are, but it also could be that Egypt is talking to other elements of Hamas aside from Sinwar. And that makes sense when you think about it, because Sinwar is the person who's calling the shots in Gaza. And Sinwar knows that the most important and useful mediators are Qatar. So he's probably talking directly to Qatar. Meanwhile, Egypt is probably seeking out other people who have less influence. And their position is different. They're willing to compromise more than Sinwar. Sinwar is really the main opponent of having a hostage deal. He feels that hostages should be maintained in order to bring Israel to heel completely, and not just in order to delay the inevitable. So in conclusion, there's a couple of things I think that we need to remember. Sinwar is looking at the hostages as the key to end this operation for a reason. He sees it, and he's 100% correct, as the Achilles heel of Israeli society and the Israeli military. Israel has massive advantages in its combat ability, in its money. Israel is also very determined to win this war. So that's not a real advantage, but it's oversensitive from Hamas's perspective to losses of soldiers. There's a limit to how much Hamas can do that, and to hostages. So hostages are the main weapon, and releasing them in for less than a massive coup, like ending the war for Sinwar, does not make sense. And we need to remember that this is a strong weakness. And every time Israel gives concessions in return for hostages, it encourages Israel's enemies to take more hostages in the future. That's how the Gilad Shalit deal, which saw Israel release one soldier in exchange for 1,000, led to an operation designed to take hundreds of hostages because they figured if we could get that much for one hostage, what can we get for 200? If they get 200, then they think if we could get Israel to cease their entire conflict, what can we get for more hostages? And it draws a never-ending cycle of these um, hostage takings that severely weaken Israel's ability to fight against its enemies. And ultimately, we need to remember there's a reason why Sinwar is saving the hostages in order to end the entire conflict. The reason is if Israel continues to press Hamas, they will collapse. Um, so You can see from that what I'm saying, that Israel needs to develop a thicker skin, at, be less pliant to demands from Hamas and from the families, um, because it's impossible to win a military operation while showing this amount of weakness. And I say this with great, great regret. So let's go to the questions now. Fred asks, do you think the commitment of the Biden administration to the two-state solution is sincere? In other words, do they truly believe this is the answer to the problem? Or are they just saying this because it has been US policy going back to the George H.W. Bush administration, or cynically just as a way to get votes? So I think that Biden administration is the ultimate in American um, status quo continuation of the foreign policy of the consensus of what people call the blob, um, the typical foreign policy ideas behind the State Department and NSC going back for generations. So they hold that approach, that traditional approach. And that's not to get votes. I don't know if there's a lot of votes in two-state solution. Um, I mean, a lot of pro-Israeli people right now, Jewish community isn't very interested in a two-state solution. And as far as I can see, the progressives are interested in one state from the river to the sea. So I don't think of the two-state solution as some kind of great vote getter. So I definitely don't think it's that. I think there are diplomatic reasons um, for the two-state solution support. Ultimately, the United States needs Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia on board for whatever it does next. They're not willing to move without a two-state solution. Whether that's cynical or not, I don't know. But I can tell you that as far as I'm concerned, as someone who is not exactly optimistic right now and thinks that success of a two-state solution is a long shot, I don't see a better option at all. And I don't think that Biden sees a better option, and I don't think a lot of the Arab state leaders see a better option. It's what we have, because if Israel continues to rule the Palestinians forever, this will keep happening. If the Palestinians rule Israel, Israelis are going to get slaughtered. So you need two states, both secure, both recognizing the rights of each other. Seems very difficult right now, but separation geographically, changes in culture, change in education system. These are things that could lead to that. And the Biden administration probably feels the same way I do. Two-state solution seems very difficult to achieve. There's no viable alternative to it whatsoever. User H22IS, it's a catchy name, asks, what is the end goal? Israel doesn't want a two-state solution and doesn't want to give Palestinians in the West Bank citizenships to live in a one-state solution. So there right now is a leadership in Israel that doesn't think strategically long term about end goals. That's the harsh truth. There's a prime minister who is trying to survive after having been hit with all sorts of um, scandals and controversy over his judicial reform, and then um, a massive failure of intelligence and strategy leading to the events of October 7th. So he's an injured, cornered animal. And what Netanyahu is doing right now is not planning a long-term strategy, but rather just trying to survive. And he thinks that if he opposes a two-state solution and tries to quote unquote tar the leaders of the opposition with that position, he can stay in power. A lot of Israeli leaders, the ones who are not currently in charge, like Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz, do see a two-state solution or an advance towards a two-state solution as the answer to this problem. Then you have the extreme right. You have people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich who think there should be a one-state solution where Israel controls everything. and Arabs are treated very badly, if not encouraged to emigrate. So the trouble isn't so much that Israel doesn't have different approaches to its end goal, as much as that it can't agree on them, and it has actors who are either acting in bad faith or have very bad ideas how this will go. So just like in the United States, you have serious controversy over the most important political issues. Israel is the same way. So there's no unified strategy. And that's why it sometimes feels like there's no end goal. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who want a two-state solution, who want peace. CD says, I honestly think that something is wrong within the IDF lately. There's too many dumb mistakes and failures. And I have to disagree with you, CD. Hamas has been preparing to fight Israel on its territory since Israel left, or at least since Hamas took over in 2007. So that's given them a very long time to prepare. And they've prepared all sorts of traps and all sorts of nightmare scenarios to kill Israeli soldiers, to demoralize the Israeli people. Um, Israel has made a terrible mistake in allowing them to organize and bring these plans into fruition. Having said that, considering how long Hamas has had to prepare, how difficult this combat area is, how heavily populated it is, and how long, um, like I said, Hamas has been basing itself there, the army is doing well. Fog of war under those conditions is incredibly intense. Every day, there's a potential for a disaster. On most days, not only has Israel not fallen into any massive traps or disasters, but they've shown great military results. I was surprised, honestly, that something like these two events hadn't happened before. Um, with this kind of mess in the Gaza Strip, these sorts of things will happen. And Hamas, when they have catastrophes and hundreds of terrorists surrender, leaders are killed, and they make terrible mistakes, they just keep on going. Israel, we have a habit, and it's part of a democracy, and it's healthy. We have a habit of overanalyzing these things, and we have a habit of saying this means that we've lost our way, we're not fighting the war well. Think about any war in history. Uh, Read about it. Look at the developments that occurred. The side that won always experienced terrible failures. You can look at the Union Army in the Civil War. You can look at the Allies, especially in the early days against the Axis in World War II, and any other war that you can think of. The winning side went through catastrophes, but they soldiered on. They learned from them. They adapted, and Israel is doing that. And I think the results on the battlefield are actually quite good. So I don't accept that. We will have more very dark, terrible days. That doesn't mean that Israel is losing the war, that anything is wrong with the IDF. And Hamas and its supporters putting a lot of effort into talking about how Israel is not a good military in order to lower morale. They know how well the army is doing on the ground, despite the setbacks of the last few days. And on a related question, Kievsky asks, is this going to be a big morale hit for the troops? Um, and I think yes, temporarily. And whether that becomes a lasting issue for the troops really depends on how society creates this. If the soldiers are who did this are scapegoated, that will lower morale, that will make soldiers question what they're doing. Instead, I think the army has handled this quite well. They said that what happened was a breaking of protocol and the rules, and they need to make sure that the rules are kept. But I think there's been sympathy for the soldiers who have been involved in this, an understanding that they're put in an impossible position by Hamas. And also, you know, there was a problem of intelligence, and they weren't told that there could be hostages around. So that's an important thing. If Israeli society continues to support the operation, the morale of the troops will be high. If Israeli society does not, and the government starts winding down the war in order to release hostages, morale will be very low. If you talk to anyone in the trenches right now in Gaza or coming out, so I've talked to them when they're in there, but I've talked to soldiers who came out for their rest, all they want is to win this war. And in order to keep their morale high, they need to be given the support in order to win this war. So let's all try and make sure to give them that support. Okay, so that's our video for today, and I will see you tomorrow, hopefully with better news.